in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Palm Industries. I have maintained for a long time that pepper spray is a way underused tool in law enforcement, and I get it. When you have to arrest someone, you do not want to have to get that stuff on you. But in personal defense or concealed carry scenarios, you want to create standoff and increase the distance, not go hands-on. I can tell you hundreds of stories about confrontations I have been involved with in real life that were resolved with some form of less lethal long before a gun would have been an option. Why not carry some in your pocket? Palm pepper spray is small, easy to carry, and it's effective. If you need something in between harsh words and a gun, this is a $12 solution. It's available on Amazon, makes a great gift. Go check them out at palmpepperspray.com. That's palm, P-O-M, pepperspray.com.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com. So in the 5 years of doing this podcast-ish, Mike and I have given each other a hard time every once in a while about like recurring phrases that each of us uses, right? and if you've been listening to us for any period of time, you've probably caught on to some of these phrases we use. One of the ones I notice Mike says a lot is that cops catch a lot of flack for X or Y or Z. And I thought about this and I was like, well, that's funny because I'm a military history nerd and flack has a very specific German World War II meaning. But also, he's got a point. Cops catch a lot of flack, it turns out. There has been, I don't know if anyone's noticed, some tension in the last couple of years.
A little bit of friction.
A little bit of friction.
Yeah.
Cops have been catching some flack, you might say, over the last couple of years about cop activities. Things like, I don't know, shooting people, shooting dogs, arresting people who probably didn't need arresting, putting their knees on the back of people's necks, and on and on and on. This is kind of snowballed in a lot of cases, and sometimes it has resulted in some really bad outcomes, like riots, lawsuits, prison, dead people. So I think it is worth exploring why and how cops are catching so much flack, and maybe, just maybe, there's something we could do about it. One, obviously, it would be great if everyone just executed everything perfectly, right? Just do your job. If only it were that simple. And it's not enough just to do your job. We also have to communicate with and engage with the public in some meaningful way, right? And now, understanding that there are civil and criminal legal considerations, like big ones, in how you release information to the public, when you're allowed to release information to the public, understanding all of that, you in your agency have a responsibility to be transparent about your practices. And it is in everyone's interest to kind of keep the records straight. That's one of the things that will prevent these big, like, PR nightmare snowballs, right?
And there is so much to unpack in that. One is to challenge your own assumptions about what those considerations are about releasing information to the public. Sometimes we have this like false sense of like, well, it's an ongoing investigation, and so therefore it's secret. Like, okay, most people don't care about that. you know? And there is a time and a place where, for example, if I release a statement that says, hey, we found this guy, it's being investigated as a murder, and we don't want to say how he was killed, because when we interview the person we think who did it, and they have some of those details that no one else has, that could be relevant, right? Like there's a very good reason to withhold things in certain cases.
So maybe explaining that reason,
Yeah.
that could probably be helpful, right?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And if you do withhold something and making sure that it's for one of those good reasons instead of just for the sake of doing it, right? Like we get stuck in this practice. And I get it because I've been on the receiving end of like the media getting it wrong. And there's been a number of times that I'm involved in an incident. I see the media release after the fact. And sometimes our own public information people get it wrong. But also, like, you take that statement that's given by the law enforcement agency, and even the media outlet will like then reword that and be like, no, that's not what we said, to be clear. But there's a bigger message in all of this when it comes to public relations stuff. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that, like, from a law enforcement perspective, a guy who's a cop, it's very easy to fall into this trap where, well, he pulled the gun, so like fuck around and find out, or play stupid games, win stupid prizes. You know, like it's easy to be like, big gulps, huh? Like, well, see you later. Like, and kind of make light of it in that sense. And the problem with that is the people that might hear or see that message don't understand it the way that we do, right? Like, we have our own perspective on it. And this is important from the position of a law enforcement officer who has to reconcile the fact that they might have to pull that trigger someday. The officer has to make peace with the fact that they might have to kill a person who makes a bad decision in a split second out of desperation. And like, I got to live with that, right? And so as part of like living with that is like, well, life's about choices, and you can kind of make light of it in that sense, right? But from the outside looking in, from someone who has never thought about it from your perspective, you don't see it that way, right? Like, you see a young man who is troubled and dealing with, you know, whatever challenges are presented in his life. You like list them out if you want, but it doesn't change the fact that in those moments, like, what you had to do was practical and reasonable, but it didn't necessarily look that way at the time. And
maybe that doesn't have to be a comment that you make in the comments section of your agency's Facebook page, right? Like, maybe fuck around and find out isn't the most helpful thing you can contribute to that conversation.
Certainly, and I agree with that. But the thing is before that comment goes public is the attitude to begin with. And we have to address that part of it. Like, we have to acknowledge that is a person who has made their own choices, who has their own challenges, and who has their own story, right? Who has a mom and a dad and a brother and a sister and a spouse or a girlfriend or a boyfriend, whatever, and who, despite their life choices, loves and cares about them and all of that. Right? Like, their own family might agree with the fact that, like, they made bad choices. They might agree with that. But there's still an emotional connection there that we're failing to tap into when we have that attitude, right? And when it comes to public affairs, you have to, like, wrap everything that you do into the lens that sells the message in a different way. And I think that's where we're going.
I like that a lot. So we were getting ready to put this episode together, and we asked a couple people in the community about public relations in law enforcement, like, you know, what can we do better? And a surprising number of people came back with some variation of, well, it's not my job, or it's not my problem. And I understand what they're trying to say, but that is troubling, right?
Yeah, it's true on some level.
Yep,
however,
I get it.
However, you have to care.
Yeah. So first off, in a free society, which arguably we are, the police are accountable to the voters and the taxpayers, right? Responsibility to the community isn't just some blurb you say in a hiring interview or a slogan on the side of the patrol car. It is what makes us us. It's what makes America great and communist China, right? The fact that we aren't like them, that we're not a police state. Think about that sentence right there, a police state. We ain't that, and we don't want to be that, and you don't want to live in that. But we hear you, and we know your agency is under-resourced. We get it? Every agency is under-resourced.
It's 2023, after all.
Yeah. We know that line officers have plenty of responsibilities on their plates, that they're expected to be psychologists and expert shooters and domestic violence counselors and life coaches and every other conceivable thing. Like, we know that. We got it. But too often, we see the impact of poor public relations. We see the anger after a police public affairs officer reads some nonsensical press release loaded with bureaucratic weasel words and cop jargon and passive voice. We see the TikTok videos of you dancing or planking or eating Tide Pods or whatever the kids are doing these days. And from that, we see, and all of that in the name of public relations, right? And we see this nationwide erosion in public confidence in law enforcement. And that is dangerous, right? Why does it matter to you? What's the so what of this episode? It's that when people stop trusting you, bad things happen to you.
They don't care about what happens to you. Yeah.
Yeah. So it raises the probability and severity of violence in the community, riots, things like riots, and violence toward cops. F the police, right? So
Obviously.
maybe we should probably do something about that. So I remember watching RoboCop when I was a kid, because that's the type of movies I watched when I was a kid. And like one of his like prime directives was uphold the public trust. I'm pretty sure that's written somewhere. What does that mean? What does uphold the public trust mean? Well, going back to, you are accountable to the public, ultimately, kind of as a fundamental philosophy, but also consider credibility is your freedom of action. You and your agency only get to move at the speed of trust. And that's not just a cute saying. Like, no, really, if the public doesn't trust you, it makes everything you do harder and everything you do more dangerous. And it gets nonsensical rules and policies dropped on you, inflicted on you, by people who are far removed from your tactical reality. It gets you rules like you're not allowed to get in a police chase unless X and Y and Z and A and B and C are true. And if people don't trust you, that list gets longer and longer and longer. So let's fix that. Let's give people reasons to give us more discretion at the lowest tactical level.
And it's not just limiting in what you're allowed to do. It also just muddies the water about like your decision making becomes a lot more clouded, right? Mm-hmm. Because you're like, oh my God, I have all these rules. I have all these things to think about and all these problems.
All these gotchas.
Yeah.
That are potentially going to get me.
Whereas if you could just think about like, this is the problem. These are my possible solutions. Like you want to simplify that, right? And the attitude of like, this is not my job, where that becomes problematic is you're not thinking about that layer of it. And so someone else has to step in and do it for you, right? Like you have to think about the lawful but awful outcome, right? Like you have to think about like, well, technically I could justify this, but it's not going to look good. It's not going to pass the headline test. And if you don't want someone to do that for you arbitrarily, then you have to think about it. It is part of your job. That's the thing.
Oh, yeah. And you work in an information environment. Like information is just one of the domains of the world you work in, right? So that is true in warfare, and that is true in street warfare, so to speak. You've heard me say in the past that credibility is a form of currency. And, we had a discussion on a previous episode. Is it tokens? Is it chips? Is it monopoly money? I don't know. But whatever form it takes, whichever way you want to take this analogy, this is where it matters, right? You have to build credibility over time with your stakeholders. And think of all the stakeholders, anyone who has some say and some interest in how police do policing. Right? That's everything. That's the state legislature. That's the chief. That's the mayor. It's the city council. That is community activists and community leaders. It's church leaders. It's teachers. It's the superintendent of schools. It is the person you are pulling over for any of 1,000 different types of reasons. It is the little old lady eating cat food because she can't afford anything, but she's paying her taxes. Right? Those are your stakeholders. And those are the people whose trust you have to earn every day. Right? And you got to build it over time because sooner or later you might have to cash in that currency and ask the public to hit that I believe button when you take a risk. When you get into one of those squishy, ugly situations, you need them to believe in you and give you some benefit of the doubt.
That's the biggest thing.
Yep.
Right?
And benefit of the doubt is not a birthright. It's not a given. Well, we're the cops and the cops are the cops, so they're the cops. So everyone should just love them and trust them and believe in them. It doesn't work that way. I'm sorry from the first person to tell you that, right?
Yeah, like when the chief of police or whoever your public affairs person stands up and says like, hey, this is the ugly situation that we had. You want people to be like, this guy has always been a straight shooter. This guy's always been upfront and honest. This guy's always been no bullshit, right? Like, because exactly what Jim is saying, like, there's going to come that day where you're like, well, things got weird. Like, here, what happened was, and you want them to be like, I get it. Okay, this was hard,
Yep.
It's a big deal.
So because of that, trust is a thing you have to earn over time. It takes years to build up this information environment to your advantage, to prepare this battlefield, right? If people don't believe in you, then they also don't believe in you. Do you feel like sometimes the community doesn't have your back? Do you feel like sometimes the cop watchers are out auditing you with their other cell phones trying to make a point?
Oh boy.
Right? Trying to get a couple more views? Well, why do you think those channels are so popular? Okay. Can you think of any problems that might cause you if the community doesn't believe in you? I can. Okay. So where this comes up in kind of the ugliest forms is those times when you got to hit the I believe button. Maybe something went wrong. Maybe a cop made a mistake. Maybe a cop was involved in something embarrassing or criminal. Maybe a cop was sleeping with half the department. Maybe there was an active shooter event that the agency as an agency didn't respond to well. Right? These can get really ugly really fast or funny, depending on, where on the spectrum we're falling. Okay. The thing I would emphasize is transparency is a big deal. And if you mess up, fess up. Right? That's part of how you build trust is when we make a mistake, we will tell you. And we will open our kimono and let everyone see it. And that takes courage and institutional courage that a lot of institution leaders don't have. But that's what you got to do.
And courage is a big way of explaining that, right? Because the big question about how do you accept responsibility for the mistakes is the how. Because there are very real legal repercussions here, right? Like, how do you accept responsibility for mistakes without accepting unnecessary liability for those mistakes? And the accountability piece is a big part of it, right? It's not just about the fault or the blame of everything, because these situations are complex, but being accountable for like your own role in that goes a long way. And what we have to see is that the legal side of those issues is a separate thing, separate issue from the public trust and the public perception. All the stuff that Jim's saying when it comes to, hey, we made a mistake. And like a guy gets in front of a podium and acknowledges these mistakes and shows the video. There's the legal side of it. That's one thing. The public perception, the public trust side of it is a whole other thing, right? And the thing that comes to mind when I think about this sort of thing is medical malpractice. And there's some research that's been done in this realm. And one of the things that came out of some of this research was, I can't remember which book I read this in. How We Decide is one, The Invisible Gorilla, Predictably Irrational, probably one of those books. I can't remember which. But they talk about like medical malpractice, and they talk about how if a patient likes a doctor and the doctor makes some like egregious error and fucks up, like they're not likely to sue them even though they messed up because they like the person. Whereas a doctor that's like very clinical, very sterile, very kind of impersonal, and the person doesn't really like them a whole lot, and they don't really do anything wrong. It's just not a good outcome because you can't predict the future. You can't fix every problem. You can't detect every little thing. Even if that doctor didn't do anything wrong, but they're unliked, they're likely to still get sued for malpractice. And so those like frivolous suits and unfounded claims are more likely if the people don't like you than if, even if you screw up, you do something otherwise well as it relates to accepting responsibility for it and being accountable to the people in that sense.
So there are going to be times when you cannot stand up and say we accept responsibility, right? Due to the lawyers will come parachute out of the ceiling and give you a hard time, right? But
shut down the news conference.
Yeah, shut it down. Okay. But consider the things you can say and how you say them matters, right? How you build that rapport with the public matters, okay? Step one is don't talk in bureaucratic weasel speak. Just don't do it. Somehow, most of the cops I've met get taught to write in this weird, robotic, overly formal style. And I think they think it sounds objective and professional. I think that's what they're trying to do.
And I think that comes from, in the academy, you have to learn how to interpret legalese a little bit. Like, you're not a lawyer, right? You're not an attorney. You're not a judge. You're not any of that. But when the legislature writes a law, you have to interpret that a certain way. And you have to write your cases in a way that satisfies that. And also, you get taught that, like, even though these things are law, there's also case law, right? Court cases that judge or direct or kind of inform the decisions that we make. And those are written in a legalese sort of way. And so like it conditions us a little bit, even though we're not lawyers or judges or anything like that, to view it through that lens.
Now, the funny thing about that is good lawyers don't gosh darn write like that. Right. The good ones. If you actually sit down and...
There's a small number of good lawyers that I've interacted with.
That's fair.
But I don't have a law degree, but I could tell you there's a lot of lawyers I've dealt with that are like,
yeah. So somewhere in there, and maybe that's what it is it's badly mimicking what smart people sound like, right? This is what it sounds like to me. Okay. It sounds... I think they think they're trying to sound objective and professional, but they're writing so grammatically backwards that it comes across disingenuous.
Yes.
And like your agency is trying to like sidestep blame and distance itself from the event. Well, best case, when you write like that, people stop listening to you, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of it is you are trying to separate the emotions from it and make it objective, right? Like
the emotions yes. The people, no.
Well, and that's the
Right.
thing is like when it comes to, there's a difference between documenting what happened in an event and conveying that to the public.
Yes. And I'm saying don't suck at it, right?
Well, sure.
So best case, if you write badly, people aren't going to read it. They're not going to listen to you. The newspaper isn't going to copy it and publish it. More likely, people will listen and they're not going to believe you. They're going to be like, these guys are obviously trying to lie to us, right? And the most common form this takes is passive voice. Passive voice makes you sound suspicious as hell, right? And if a suspect on a scene started talking like that in passive voice, like, and then a shooting occurred, shrug, or the vehicle that hit the light pole was driven by persons on the scene, you'd be like, what are you trying to pull here? Right? You would roll your eyes, you'd hook them up. And like, so if you wouldn't let like a suspect talk like that, don't let your agency talk like that, right? Credibility is currency. Credibility is freedom. So about passive voice, because I understand this confuses some folks. Passive voice in its most basic form is when you structure a sentence backwards from standard American English. So in effect, the subject of the sentence is disconnected from or after the action in the sentence. Okay. In normal American English, you would say, Mike drank the beer.
Yes, he did.
In bullshit agency speak, you would say, the beer was consumed by personnel on the scene. The incident is under investigation and we have no further comment at this time. Right? Anyone listening to that would be like, oh, obviously they're trying to lie to me. So like, don't do that. Right. Or you would say, Mike was in the living room and a beer drinking occurred. If one of the clues here is that if you're adding words that you wouldn't use in normal conversation, you're probably wrong. Right. And if you are trying to distance yourself in like linguistically, you're probably wrong. Don't do that. It's not helping. Okay. And one of the little like, I got this from one of my favorite colonels in the Air Force. There's a trick to catching yourself. If you can add the phrase by zombies after the action word, the verb, you're probably wrong. So for example, like the beer was drunk by zombies. If you can end it with by zombies, you're probably wrong. So like if you say Mike drank the beer, you can't really add by zombies to that. Mike drank by zombies the beer. Like that wouldn't make any sense, right? So if adding by zombies jacks up the sentence, you're probably using passive voice. That's your clue. Thank you, Colonel Stacy.
It's right. The zombies, obviously. This is... I've got a lot on this. So like... when we reached out to people and we're like, because like passive voice is something that comes up a lot, passive versus active voice, and
it makes you sound stupid.
Yeah,
Just don't do it.
And
right?
I feel like I'm a pretty good writer. I feel like I write well, and I even told Jim when we were doing this outline, I'm like, hey, like we got to explain this better because like I don't have a great explanation, really. So we reached out to some people, and one of the things that came up was like omit unnecessary words. That was a
yes,
piece of
shoe obfuscation.
Yeah, there was a book called The Elements of Style by Strunk and White, and it was a
big fan
required reading back in the day when I was in school. And I actually made, when I was a field training officer, I made my rookies read it or at least flip through it. And omit unnecessary words was one of the things that came up in that book as like a piece of writing advice that I've always lived to. Like, oh, you have to write a memo because you're applying to, like, you want to be a member of the SWAT team or you want to join K9 or, you know, whatever. And if the words are unnecessary, like, get rid of them. And that was one of the key things to me when it comes to like passive voice. If you have extra like fluff in there, extra words, that comes up a lot. And taken beyond just the grammar and the writing, I also think that when it comes to words in general, this is a bigger deal than just public relations. There is a famous officer-involved shooting by a guy named Deputy Kyle Dinkheller that happened in, I think it was like 97, 98, in which a traffic stop occurs. The driver of the truck that gets pulled over is like a Vietnam veteran. A little altercation happens, and the guy starts loading a rifle, like an M14 or an M1, I can't remember which. And there's dash cam video of this event. It's a pretty famous case. Like this video is all over the place. And the deputy is heard saying for about 23 seconds, I think, like, put the gun down, while this guy's like loading a rifle. And ultimately what ends up happening is the deputy finally, after 20 something seconds, fires a round at this dude, decides that he has to shoot him. The guy executes the officer and drives off. And that's kind of how it goes. It's like, it's an ugly video to watch. As a police trainer watching that thing, I'm like, this is like a trainer's worst nightmare. Like, you watch this guy get killed and it feels totally preventable, right? And when I show this video to a class full of recruits, there's a class that I teach, every recruit class gets, I show it to them and I'm like, what do you have to do here? What do you think was the answer? What should this guy have done? And they'll always say something like, engage the threat, or like eliminate the target. Like, they use these kind of vague words. And I'm like, the answer is you got to kill him. Like, don't fluff that up, because this has bigger implications than just public relations, right? It's also about making sense of the fact that you might have to kill a person and reconciling that with like your own moral compass, however that looks, right? Like, and what you don't want to do is spend 20 something seconds thinking about that in the moment when a guy's loading a rifle and getting ready to shoot you with it, to go like, oh, I should eliminate the target. Like, bullshit. Like there's no safe language there, right? Like, your life depends on the next course of action. And so taking that a step further, when it comes to public relations, like, words mean things, right? Like, you've heard us say that 1,000 times. Words mean shit. And this is like basic marketing and salesmanship and all of that. If you put the audience, the public, in the shoes of that officer, and you think about like what it means to like, oh my God, this guy's loading a gun, he's going to kill me, I have to do something. That's what you're trying to convey.
Create some empathy, right? Yeah. We talk about empathy a lot, like, oh, we need our officers to have empathy. Well, that's, yes, we do. One of the things we also have to do is help the public
have empathy,
establish some empathy, right? For the officer.
Yeah.
Right?
You want them to feel what they felt and to see what they saw. Like, present them with a problem. This is marketing 101, right? Like, the only marketing experience I have is signing sponsors up for the podcast, but like,
which is why we're rolling in cash.
Totally. But like present a problem and then offer a solution, right? And when you make it like vague and impersonal, you're not doing anyone a favor. Not only on the public safety front, but even for those individual cops, you're not doing them any favors.
So when Mike uses language like engage or eliminate the threat, what he's describing here is euphemism. Euphemism, fancy word, using language to soften or disconnect from the event. Your mom didn't die, she passed away. You didn't shoot the dude 25 times in the face, you engaged the threat pursuant to your agency's use of force policy. I understand where this comes from, and sometimes it's very appropriate, right? Like when we're talking to the family of the person who got shot 25 times, maybe we don't need to say that, right?
Well,
but you need to understand. Was that?
But you should say that they are dead, not that they something vague. They are no longer with us, and so the officers did what they had to do.
Yeah, don't do that. Yeah. And you need to understand that language like that doesn't fool anybody. What it does is degrade your credibility that you're not being a straight shooter, right? Another one I want to stop is bad apologies, okay? I realize that 100 years of lawyer TV shows have trained us to be terrified, and some cases legitimately terrified, of taking responsibility. But cowboy the hell up, right? At some point, that's why leaders are leaders, is because they're supposed to be accountable. That's why they got voted in or appointed in to their offices to be in charge and to be responsible, right?
Yeah, you want to be the boss, seen as a straight shooter, no bullshit kind of guy.
The buck stops with you.
Yeah.
Right?
Like, who doesn't want that?
So, at minimum, don't do a non-apology. I realize I put a lot of double negatives in there, but work with me. Non-apologies are statements like, mistakes have been made. Wonderful. That's great if you're like in the movie Stranger Things or the show Stranger Things, explaining like, oh yeah, we opened up a portal to another dimension full of demons. That's cool. But when we're talking about like, yeah, hey, there was an officer involved shooting and it had a bad outcome. Like you say, there was an officer involved shooting and it had a bad outcome. Use words, right? First off, you can add by zombies to the statement, mistakes have been made. Therefore, you know already it's passive voice. Mistakes have been made by zombies.
Right? That was brilliant, by the way. Like
that's why she's a colonel. All right. Also, it's bullshit. Don't do that. Just say what you're trying to say. There's a book called The 5 Languages of Apology, and I think it should be required reading at like every high school in the country. I think it would make better professionals, better cops, better military people, better spouses, better everything, okay? 5 Languages of Apology. It's by the same folks who did the 5 Love Languages, which you should probably also read, but that's a different story, different podcast episode, right? So if you're wondering why the masses are still rioting, even after the chief got up and said mistakes have been made, maybe it's because the masses wanted to hear a real gosh darn apology, right? That might involve expressing regret. We're sorry this happened. This should not have happened. You can say that. Accepting responsibility. We're sorry we did this. Now I realize, oh my God, the lawyers. So talk it over with the lawyers, but aim for that, right? Making restitution. We messed up and we're going to fix it. Genuinely repenting. We feel really bad about this and we want to be better. And requesting forgiveness. We're sorry we pepper sprayed that unarmed, compliant black man in the face because he didn't get out of the car fast enough, and we're gonna ask him to please forgive us. Have you ever heard an agency chief use language like that? I can't think of an example. I'm sure it's happened, but man, you got to really work to find something like that. I think we can get there. One direction I want to take this is understanding that public outreach strategy matters. It has to be part of your overall operational strategy, right? Information engagement needs to be part of how you go after the problem of fighting crime in your area. And also, you need a specific public outreach strategy. So public outreach is part of your overall op plan. And then you need a strategy for how you're going to do that specifically. Okay. That means allocating resources, people. Hire some public affairs people. Money. You need to put money into this. Otherwise, you're not going to get very much engagement and reach. and you need to dedicate some time to it. Okay? Those are resources you have to allocate to this strategy. And I can tell a lot about a strategy by seeing what resources actually got allocated and which ones didn't. It also means setting objectives and lines of effort. So, there's basic like how you do any goal. It has to be specific, measurable, achievable, based on some sort of time limit, that kind of thing. And it also needs to be helpful. So are you measuring effort or are you measuring outcomes? So I would offer, don't just strategize, let's do 3 coffee with a cop events this year. That's not a strategy. Okay. How about the goal of let's make sure at least 80% of this town knows the 9 o'clock routine, right? You go around your house, make sure your doors are locked, make sure your lights are on every night. And if anyone in town gets asked, hey, can you tell me about the 9 o'clock routine? They should be able to tell me something about it. They should have heard about it. They should know it. We should be getting some kind of a feedback from the town that it's working. And even better, let's see some evidence that people are following it. Let's see car break-ins go down. And in this strategy, understand that not all public engagement is in the form of dry press release blurbs or press briefings. In fact, those pretty clearly have limited utility. People don't watch them. People don't read them. You need direct communication and understand you've got a lot of different audiences. Some people in a community, especially in a big community, some people are all about social media, right? I look at Facebook, 700 times a day. If you get it out on Facebook, I'm probably going to see it. Not everyone is wired like me, right? Some people watch the morning news. Some people need billboards and handbills. If they don't see it up on their way to work, they're not going to consume it, right? Some people need a clever meme. If it's not funny, they're not going to process it. And I'll tell you what, there are actually a couple agencies. There are a couple in Florida. There's a Bangor, Maine has a really engaging, funny Facebook presence, and people latch onto it and they will listen, right? Because they're looking for the joke, but somewhere in the joke, they might get a bait and switch with a good lesson for what the agency is trying to convey. Some people need a podcast, hopefully. Obviously. And not to mention, you've got language and literacy barriers around the community. You have learning styles and learning deficiencies in some cases around the community. But opening up those channels, those ways that you can get communications out across a broad spectrum, those will help you build rapport. And it's also going to keep a conduit open when you need to push information in a crisis. When things get nasty and you need everyone to hear a message, those avenues and having people already liked and subscribed and listening and with notifications on and signed up for Nixly. Do they even know what the hell Nixly is? Does your agency do it? Like that's when this is where you do the prep work so that when the chips are down, you can get your side of the story out, your narrative out.
I think prep work is a big part of this, is understanding when it comes to public trust, what you're talking about is the prep work, right? Like it's earning that on the front end so that when you do have to stand up and say like, oh, it got weird, you've earned that, right? The other big thing about the strategy piece is, why not hire like actual marketing and PR people for this sort of thing and not put cops in that position who don't have any expertise in that area, right? Like we tend to make these like public information, public affairs people cops that have no business doing that kind of work, right? And it's not that, going back to the very beginning, cops should be concerned with that. It's not that it's like your job per se, but you should still think about the public perception, public information stuff.
Or when they hire a dedicated public affairs person, they have no experience at all with law enforcement and they can't speak with any credibility on law enforcement. So you get one extreme or the other. You get the cop that can't talk, or you get the snazzy talker that doesn't understand any cop stuff and can't speak usefully for cops.
Yeah, 100%. And like the thing is like there's this balancing act that has to happen, because what makes a good cop is not necessarily the same thing as what makes a good marketing PR person. And we have to recognize this as a marketing and PR problem, right? Like there's some salesmanship that happens here.
So should you do TikTok videos? Like
Obviously.
dancing, maybe Mike breaking it down, maybe Officer Mike with his guitar. Well, maybe if your objective is to humanize your people, and there is some value there, right? We've talked about that in the road rage episode. If all I see is the cop car, and I don't see there's an actual human being, then I haven't accomplished what I want, right? Maybe the TikTok video of the dancing, maybe him boogieing down, maybe that's what's going to get that humanizing humanity that I want, right?
Yeah. The problem is if that's all you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, like humanize the badge. I get that. Like do the TikTok, do the basketball videos and the dances and the bullshit, but like that's pretty superficial, right? Like you have to go past that.
I'll tell you, one of my favorite Instagram pages is a canine officer giving his canine like a puppuccino. That's adorable as hell. I love it. It doesn't make me want to speed any less, but like, I like that. It's cool.
It's the problem, right?
Yeah.
And also, if that department does something stupid, it doesn't make it better.
Yeah. So how do you get ahead of that stuff? Well, I would offer host visits and tours of distinguished visitors, of those key stakeholders, right? Encourage ride-alongs. Have an active and engaging social media presence, like you need to do that. Let reporters come meet the canines, and not just like the cool little clip of, the dog chasing a tennis ball. Let the reporter suit up, put on the bite suit, experience what that's like, hear the commands, hear how loud and clear they are, right? One of the most persuasive things I've seen in terms of this engagement is having reporters do the shoot, no shoot drills. And not just the reporters, have the district attorney staff do it. Let them see how little time you have to make a decision. Okay? Let the city council do it. Let the church leaders do it. Let policymakers, state legislators, those types, let them see the impact of their policies. Because if they don't do that, they, as far as they're concerned, they sign it out of line, whatever the lobbyist told them to do, and they save the world until they realize that policy they made impacted you, the officer, right?
Yeah. The only problem, I'll push back on Jim a little bit with that, just to say that the only problem with those strategies is they kind of, you have to recognize their limitations, right? Like you have to remember that, like, frankly, a lot of people that we're trying to win over, they don't even watch the news, or they're not informed to begin with. They're not interested in doing ride-alongs. They're not going to come out, and they're not looking at their district attorneys or their politicians. A lot of times they're not. That's not even on their radar, right? And so we cater to some of that on some level. Like we think that, like, these are the people that are paying attention. These are the people that have the audience that can help us convey this message if we can win them over. And we have to acknowledge that, like, the community at large, like, we're still missing a huge portion of that, right? Like,
oh yeah.
And this is where, like, social media actually has a lot of potential, because you can break past some of that, right? Like, people might not watch the 9 o'clock news, but they might come across something on Facebook or Instagram, right? Like you could capitalize on that if you could sell it well, but you can't, like, predict going viral. That's not how that works. Like, it's some things will go and some won't, right? So, like, you have to, like, recognize the limitations in that, I think.
That's fair. Similarly, like Coffee with a Cop, I know a couple agencies that are big on doing Coffee with a Cop a couple times a month. It can be good if you manage it well, and if you're not just having coffee with the same dozen old timers who were already at the coffee place, right?
And that's the thing, is, like, usually you get the cop supporters that go to that, right?
Yeah.
Like, helpful,
so you can,
kind of.
Yeah, so you can get into the same problems that Mike mentioned with the ride-alongs. Neighborhood watch. It can be a great way of getting left of bang, right? Not only will you get potential contacts from people and hear what they're experiencing, it will get people to be more willing to contact you earlier, right? And you think about episodes we've done about home security and neighborhood Facebook pages. People say, hey, there's somebody shady driving around the neighborhood. Well, those neighborhood watch engagements are where you can encourage people to say, yeah, hey, go ahead and call us. That can help you get ahead of some of these bad guy activities. It's also your chance to dispel myths and rumors. And it's your opportunity to harden potential victims against criminals, to remind them how often unlocked cars get broken into, how often break-ins are happening in their neighborhood, ground them in some kind of reality. A couple of our listeners suggested, make the public just not be so dumb. Well, God, I'd love to do that.
Obviously, that's the solution. Maybe we
also, you should never be the public affairs guy if you posted that on our page. Not the sweetest way to say it, but actually, I agree. I think law enforcement could do a lot to help set the community members up for success, to make the community not so dumb. And it's an uphill battle, and you're not going to get perfect success, and that's okay, right? But
the thing is,
here's the thing.
Yeah. This is one of those scenarios where if you think you're better than somebody, then fucking act like it.
Yep.
They don't understand, so help them understand. It's just not that simple, right?
Yeah. So, educate the public. Do folks in your town know when to call 911? And when not to call 911, maybe you got that, as a DARE officer came and visited you in elementary school 40 years ago or something. But for real, what engagement has your agency had with the locals about when to call and when not to call, right? If you have a non-emergency line, do people know it, or do they just go to 911? That's easy. That's low-hanging fruit that you can put out on a Facebook post, right? If not, that's a public affairs failure. That's one of the first things you should get sorted out. Do the drivers in your town know how to handle a traffic stop? And there are some very educated, very high-functioning people who really, really don't know how to handle getting pulled over by the cops. Have the locals ever been taught what it is you want them to do when you get behind them and put your lights on? And that might be really obvious to you because you do it all the time. But this is one of those empathy things. Understand that is not obvious to my wife, who has been pulled over one time 15 years ago, right? I'll bet there's a lot that we could do and that we could teach the public as far as how to handle a traffic stop that would make it safer and more calm for both sides of that traffic stop equation. Let's try that. Can you do a demo? Can you do a YouTube video? Hey, when we pull you over, understand we can't see your hands and we don't know you're a good guy, right? Just explaining that might help, again, with the empathy thing. Don't assume people know what you know. Don't assume that they know what a taser is. They don't have a reason to know what a taser is unless they've been on the receiving end of one. Or why sometimes it's useful and sometimes it's not. Well, if you don't explain that, they don't understand why you shot that guy instead of just tasering him, right? Don't assume people know why shooting the guy in the leg isn't a thing. And it helps to have those conversations with the community before you shoot the guy, right? Again, it's the prep work. As far as trends and patterns in your town, do the drivers in your town know where the car wrecks tend to happen? They might. But you actually might have some good data on that. Hey, we go to this intersection 3 times a day. That's why we want you to slow down going through this intersection. We're not just trying to get ticket revenue from you, right? For me, that gets into the fundamental role of policing. What's the point of having cops? Is it to make the people safer, or is it to send bad guys to jail? Those aren't necessarily always the same thing, right? If you're there to protect the public, why not, in your information operations, communicate things that will help protect the public. Let me say that again because it's important. If your job is to protect the public, why don't you incorporate that in your information operations?
Well,
and
so the key thing that you said there is that there is an information operations, right? Like,
yes,
it's that recognizing that the public information side of it isn't a separate thing. It's a supplemental thing. It's part of the bigger picture, right? Like, it's
Absolutely.
not just its own, like, oh, and then also we have to talk about the public information stuff. Like, no, that's part of the bigger picture.
Yes. If your goal is to protect the public. If it's not, if it's something else, maybe you should do some soul searching on that, right?
Examine that, yeah.
So this information operations thing is why communication is part of your strategy, right? Can you convey a message to the people that will cut the number of violent crimes or phone scams or retail theft? This stuff isn't hard, but it's important if you want to make a difference in the community. Consider sending an officer to every senior care center in the community and explaining like the top 3 scams you guys are seeing. And I suspect if you do, you're going to hear about a lot more, right? What about posting lessons on your Facebook page to help the small businesses in the area cut shoplifting? And, they should know, but do they? I'd suspect probably not. The big retail places, they've got their systems down, but a mom and pop shop may not, right? Is your department publishing stats on speed-related fatalities, right? Or is your department just running radar in unmarked cars on poor slobs like me just trying to get to work?
This is...
I have feelings about this one.
Yeah. But if you can convey why speed is such a big deal, then maybe it has different weight.
Yeah, because otherwise I don't believe you and I don't believe in you.
And also,
as far as I'm concerned, but as far as I'm concerned, you're just some guy in an unmarked car trying to jack up revenue, right? And until you explain the why, I don't really care about the what or the who. Whenever you can release video, do, right? And body-worn cameras have made a big difference as far as being able to show the world from your perspective. They're not perfect. They're never going to be perfect. But consider that immediately shows the world what Officer Friendly saw, right? Similarly with photos, a good, compelling picture is worth $1 million when it comes to trying to get resources. Use the cameras. Encourage the cameras, right? And as far as like your written and spoken communication, you need to be clean, you need to be clear, you need to be compelling. And that usually means hiring someone who can be those 3 things, right? Hire someone who can talk and write with credibility, authority, and clarity.
And also who can handle and respond to difficult questions. People who can deal with that sort of thing without getting flustered, without getting defensive. And what is that type of person? Like I mentioned earlier that your marketing PR person might not be a police officer, right? Like you have to consider that might not be the best person for that job. You want to consider the attributes involved in a PR marketing realm, right? Someone who is patient and calm and detail oriented. And Jim mentioned earlier about why can't we just shoot the guy in the leg? He used that as an example. Well, that's a perfect case where you need someone who can handle a difficult question about why didn't he shoot him in the leg? Well, that's a great question. Let me explain all the reasons why that's a terrible idea, right? Without getting why would you do that? No,
without being condescending,
right.
Without being blustery, right. Say, we thought about that.
That's a good question.
Funny you should mention that.
We've considered that, and as it relates to our training and our practice, these are the reasons we don't do that.
Yep.
It's easy, right? It should be easy.
And then you invite that person who asked that question to come with you for the shoot, no shoot drill, or to wear the bite suit or whatever, right? That's your in to get those conversations going. So note that those characteristics that Mike rattled off about who that person is, those are not always the same characteristics of a law enforcement leader.
I mean, they should be.
Should be. But sometimes you need to put the chief or the sheriff up at the lectern, and sometimes you're better off with a trained public affairs person. When do you use each person? And well, it depends. It depends on what you're trying to do. When do you put the chief up? Well, when it's an accountability thing, usually.
And from a practical standpoint, like, there should be a very solid bridge between the two, right? Like,
oh yeah,
they should be in sync. Like, the chief can get up there, or the sheriff can get up there and say, like, hey, we fucked up. These are some of the things that we could have done different. And then the PR person, and then this person's going to answer whatever further questions you have. Thank you. Have a good day.
Yep.
And then the PR guy gets up there and says, what do you want to know? And handles the rest.
Yep. So, Mike, can you make this a practical example for our slower learners? Like, what would be, where would the rubber really meet the road on this?
Yeah. Actually, this came up recently with a discussion that we had with my team just this week, actually. We talked about a scenario where, let's suppose a carjacker, right? Guy steals a car from some person, and the cops get behind them, chase them, and he flees into a house. And he is presumed to be armed. But when the cops see him run out of the car into the house, there's no weapons seen. And the house is presumed to be occupied and not his. Right? So, like, cops get behind this car that was stolen at gunpoint. They chase this car down. He goes and, what seems to be forces his way into a house that's not his. And so the cops surround the place, and they try to establish some dialogue with the person and the people inside. And at some point, the guy comes outside momentarily, looks around, and then decides to go back in. And the discussion was, like, would you shoot that guy? You didn't see a weapon, but he's presumed to be armed. He was armed during the original event. We assume that the people inside are being held against their will. And what this came down to was, you can make a legal argument that that person is presenting some danger to the people inside that house, right? Like, you can make that argument that it is justified to shoot that person if he comes outside, decides to turn around and go back inside to prevent him from potentially harming those people. And the question is, can you make the moral argument, right? Like, there's a legal argument there, but can you make the moral argument? Can you sell it, right? Can you sell it to the public? What if it turns out down the road that guy happened to be associated with those people somehow? You didn't know that at the time, but they're like distant family members. They're not people being held against their will. They're people who kind of know the guy. They're going to deny it because they don't want to get in trouble, but they're not really being held against their will there. But the cops decide that I can't live with myself if I let that guy go back inside and this turns into like a hostage scenario where someone gets killed and I didn't do anything, right? So this scenario, as like a thought experiment, as like a critical thinking exercise, if you want to call it that, was void of a lot of circumstances that would make that decision very easy, right? There are things that you could say that would be like, okay, well, obviously I have to shoot that guy, right? Or obviously I don't have enough information. And it was intentionally vague, I would say. But when you look at some of those presumptions that you have to make, you have to say like, well, these are my assumptions, but they haven't been validated. But it's in the interest of public safety. It's in the interest of the people inside that I assume these things to be true, right? Like, that gets really murky, right? That gets muddy. That gets unclear. And the problem with this type of discussion, this tabletop that we did, is that many or most, I would say, cops are framing the use of force decision around justified or not, right? Like, can I make a legal argument here? And the legal argument is, look, this guy is, he's committed a violent felony against a person by carjacking a car by force at gunpoint. He's presumed to be armed. He ran into an occupied structure that we assume to be occupied by people who are innocent and unknown to him. He came outside, and I don't want to allow him back inside access to those people, right? After already committing violent crimes against people. Justifiably, that's pretty easy, right? Like from a legal standpoint, that's pretty easy. But this is why we have to talk about those like lawful but awful decisions, right?
They shot my unarmed baby in the back. That's the narrative that will go out before you guys even get to the lectern.
Particularly when the information that you have no possible way of knowing comes out after the fact. And that's the issue, right? Like, you didn't have a way of knowing. You're operating under like this legal doctrine, justification. Like, you're not doing the wrong thing, right? Your head's in the right place. Your heart's in the right place. But the information is incomplete. That's the reality that we live in, right? And so, like, these are the difficult decisions that we have to make. And sometimes you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Like, you don't know right from wrong, but you have to make the assumption in favor of the community or the public or the potential victims, not of the suspect, right? Like, so the important thing here is you have to justify or frame those decisions in more than just a legal sense. You have to also frame and justify those things in a moral sense and in a public trust sense, right? And let's suppose that kind of incident doesn't go well, right? Or maybe it goes just fine, but there are questions, there are concerns. From a PR perspective and a narrative perspective, you have to frame that around not just the legal justification, but also the moral justification. And a lot of people have no problem disagreeing with like the law, right? Like, laws are easy to disagree with, but when you make it a moral thing and you can put someone in your shoes and be like, if those people in there were being held against their will and that guy came outside and I had an opportunity to stop him, it would be the wrong thing for me to do to let him go back inside and continue to victimize those people, right? So what the goal or the objective of a marketing or PR person should be is to win the hearts and minds, right? To show or convey to the public that their hearts were in the right place. Not just that they were legally justified, not just that they were following policy, that they were in the right place when they made those decisions. And I think that says a lot more from a marketing perspective than state law or like statutes or case law, any of that. So
yeah, and you know, there's a time and a place to make the legal argument, and that's in the courtroom, right? And the court of public opinion doesn't exactly work that way. but you have an opportunity to put out your narrative, and I think that is a thing you got to be good at. And one of the things I like about Mike's example is I think it illustrates that if you've done your work up front to build rapport and build credibility with the public, this gets a lot easier to navigate, even when you have the crying family member in front of the news saying they shot my baby in the back and he was crying for his mama and he didn't have a gun.
Yeah.
Right. And you have to know that's going to happen. And you have to have your information operations ready to be open, honest, transparent, credible, and capable.
Well, and like part of the empathy component of the messaging there is to be able to say that, like, yeah, I'm sure he was a good dude who was trying to get his life on track and who had a family who loved him and all these things. And this is a product of, unfortunately, split-second decisions that were made in moments of desperation.
That we made in a desperate moment.
Well,
right?
But also that he made. You can convey that, like, the person made bad decisions when they were desperate.
True.
Without compromising the fact that he has a family who loves him. Like, without dehumanizing him. Like, you can still sell that and be like, look, this is one of those things where, like, I'm sure if they have the opportunity to sit down at a table and, like, have a conversation, we could have had common ground and made everything okay. Unfortunately, the circumstances were such that was not the case. And dude pulled out a gun and officers were in this immediate, state of desperation, like Jim said. And so, like, in their mind, the only solution was they had to shoot the guy. Is what it is.
Yep.
It's a bummer, but these were the circumstances we were presented with.
Yep. And you will be able to navigate that much better if you've done the legwork up front. A little segue. We were working on this, and one of the things that I take a lot of pride in is we want to listen to our listeners.
Absolutely.
Right. And so we put a thing out on our Facebook page who said, hey guys, tell us what you think we should know and what we should talk about in terms of public engagement and public affairs.
And there's one thing I want to attack on that, Jim, actually.
Oh.
There were a couple people in response to that post who had some things like, why is that my problem? Or should you put more shit on my plate? Like, do you want to give me more problems to manage? And, like, one of the things that I hope this episode sort of attacks or addresses is that mentality. Like, you have to see this as an extension of the operational truth that we face, right? So, like, if you were one of the people who responded there with, like, kind of throwing your hands up and saying, like, well, why should I have to add more jobs to my already difficult job, or more tasks, or more, like, responsibility? It's like, well, this is part of what we do, right? Like, we signed up for a selfless job. It's not just about us. It's about the big picture. So,
yeah. So I'll read off a couple of the comments and hopefully our listeners can gain some further insight from them. One listener said, hire someone or multiples who are qualified to market, right? It's worth the price, and often departments aren't willing to pay. You got to be willing to pay. Totally agree. Next, talk up your people. This is a law enforcement affair. Wall of silence, like, that bullshit has to go. Like, there's no... that wall of silence isn't working. No. Tell the public about the good stuff. Tell the public about the bad stuff and how it's being fixed. You want people to trust your people? Have a dialogue. You got to get the two-way communication thing going. One person said, ugh, don't we have enough to do? I think we hit that one already. Also, another person said, why should the police improve public engagement? Because I think that we are snowballing right now, and that loss of credibility is putting people in danger. One person responded, not a direct answer to this specific question, but all city councilmen, aldermen, whatever your city calls them, should have to do an evening ride-along once a month in alternating precincts to see the effects of their laws in action and the enforcement required to uphold them. In the long run, they will better represent their constituents and possibly work toward fostering an environment where police public engagement is improved. I agree. I don't know that you're necessarily going to get them out there, but I think if you regularly, publicly invite them, goodness will come from that.
I also don't know that, like, for the most part, the laws that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis are the things that are pretty well established. And I'm not saying there's not, like, here and there opportunities that, like, we could have a new law that can help us in a new way. But, like, for the most part, it's just not that far removed from, like, social norms in a big way.
Agree. I'll take a little tangent for philosophy right now. I'm a little bit of a libertarian, and one of the things about being a libertarian is that anytime someone says there ought to be a law, what they're really saying is, I want to be able to send someone with a gun to force someone else to do what I want. Right?
True. Yep.
So if you say there ought to be a law that you can't sell loose cigarettes in the city of New York City, well, you're going to send Officer Friendly to go arrest people who are selling loose cigarettes, right? And there was a fatality over that. And then everyone was like, whoa, we didn't mean to actually kill people over loose cigarettes. And it turns out that had consequences. My city has a barking dog ordinance. It's understandable. People should be good neighbors. A very helpful neighbor called the cops because my dog barked once while my wife was at the gym. They effectively literally sent a man with a gun to my front door. And, like, to me, that means something. It's symbolic. And yeah, I made an effort to be a good neighbor and good citizen and stuff. But I didn't appreciate that, right? So the people passing those ordinances might see the impacts of their ordinances. I think there's value there. Another one of our listeners pointed out, seriously, stop shooting the dog.
Speaking of barking dogs.
Well, yeah. So here's the thing. If that officer had gone around the back fence and my dogs had come out, he very well could have, right? So on one hand, as a dog lover and as someone who thinks that we need to think twice about killing animals, I agree. I think there have been several cases, pretty horrifying cases, where dogs got shot that really didn't need shooting, right?
Absolutely.
There have also been some instances where dogs needed shooting. And this is where public affairs and public engagement and posting the video and saying, hey, this is what we experienced, this is what we saw. Not all dogs are just like your little Fluffy. And
also,
even your little
what would you do?
Yeah.
If that was you and this dog was doing X, what would you do?
What do you want us to do? Exactly. And realistically, what do you want us to do? Right. One person suggested smile sometimes. I agree. I think, and we talked about this in our professionalism and roboticism episode, I think somewhere in some police academies, a lot of law enforcement officers are taught they're supposed to have like this like dry expression, dry scowl, professionalism. I think you're allowed to be human. You're allowed to say hi to people as you pass them in the street. I think that's one of the things that makes you a human to them and them a human to you. It's basic humanity. I think it's a good thing. Let's do it.
Pro tip.
One person suggested more short-form infographics explaining common situations where the public interacts with police. I totally agree with that. Releasing body cam footage as the default post-incident response. Totally agree. Publicity statements being made on all social media platforms. You got to hit all the different platforms because people consume media in different ways. Community outreach events in neighborhoods where the public can interact in a town hall, two-way capacity. Totally agree. Get to know your local officer event for more of the same. Offer some kind of home security auditing or general awareness home security training for neighborhoods. Totally agree. Let's harden the targets. Let's make it hard to be a bad guy. I think that's a great point. And is everyone going to take advantage of it? No. But if I can get just even a single-digit percentage of people taking advantage of it and get a single-digit percentage drop in crime, or channelize the bad guys into one area where I can focus my efforts, that's a win, right? Anything to help people meet officers more regularly before the bad stuff happens that also provides additional value to the public for opting in. I thought that was a great point. So we really appreciate the engagement with our public on this. I think that you need to understand you operate in an information landscape. Information is part of your operating environment, whether you think it's your job or not, right? Yep. I think that your agency needs to have a strategy for it, and that strategy needs resourcing and goals. I think if you use passive voice, you're a bad person and you should feel bad about yourself.
Suck less.
Suck less. I think if you're confused about passive voice, ask yourself, could I add by zombies on the end of the sentence, and that will help you catch it. And don't assume your audience is too dumb to recognize weasel speak. Like, weasel speak is so blatantly obvious to anyone who knows to look for it that just understand you're just burning credibility for nothing when you do that. So don't do it. And you're allowed to cowboy up, man up, woman up, whatever else up, and say, yeah, this happened. We were involved. We didn't like the outcome. We're sorry. We're going to fix it. And we beg the forgiveness of the injured party. And if you can't say that, I don't think you're responsible enough to have a power over me, frankly, as a libertarian. So I hope that helps. Be smart out there. Be safe out there. Mike, what you got?
I would just say that in terms of those difficult conversations and the things that you have to convey, all the things that Jim said are true. Definitely be willing to acknowledge your mistakes, be willing to accept responsibility, but also try to put people in the shoes of those guys and gals that are out there doing the thing. And I don't expect that a PR or marketing person is some random kid that would be out in the field. It should be someone who is selected and retained for that purpose. And that purpose has to be someone who can convey what it's like to have to make those difficult decisions and explain why we're not always going to get them perfectly correct. There's no way that we can do this job without mistakes, right? And that doesn't mean that we did anything wrong at the end of the day, like that we're unreasonable in how we performed. But you got to put people in those shoes. You have to communicate that. So it's possible. Just make sure you're picking people for the right reasons. That's all I got.
Right on. And it is time for officers on the scene to consume the beverages, or the beverages were consumed by officers on the scene. I don't even know anymore. By zombies.
Whiskey.
Huzzah.
By zombies. All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.